The next witness is Mr. Ferris.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Will you tell the Commission your full name and occupation?
So my full name is Michael Victor Ferris, and I'm currently the Director of the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, and this is a voluntary role, and I've held that since the beginning of 2018.
And you've made a statement dated 27 April 2021 to the Royal Commission. Do you confirm that that statement is true and correct?
Yes, I do.
I'm going to refer you to some of the paragraph numbers, and I know that you're keen to elaborate on those and talk to the Commission. Sure. Could you tell the Commission about your role with CCHR, paragraph 1 on?
Okay, well, I have been involved with CCHR since 1989 and helped get it going again actually at that point, because it's kind of lapsed during the middle 80s. And we picked it up again and we investigated. One of our first investigations was deep sleep treatment in Cherry Farm and exposed that. But then we started getting these Lake Alice stories coming through. So there was a focus on that as well. We've been building up a considerable body of knowledge about Lake Alice over the years, as you've heard with Victor. So my submission really picks up on the work done by CCHR to get the Lake Alice case before the United Nations.
So tell us about CCHR making submissions to the United Nations, and that's covered at paragraphs 7 to 10, if you could just summarise.
Sure. So as you've heard from Victor, he was researching the United Nations procedures along with Steve Green, who was the director of CCHR at that time. And they submitted, and New Zealand was a signatory to the United Nations Convention Against Torture, and they'd also enacted the Crimes of Torture Act in 1989. So they put together a submission. It was entitled Allegations of Torture and or Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. It contained information about ongoing issues of people being held in seclusion and restraints, and lack of effective recourse for the mentally ill, whose rights were being abused in the mental health system. But the main focus of the submission was about Lake Alice and the lack of an independent and impartial investigation of the events that occurred there. So
tell us what your view was of the New Zealand government responding to your application to United Nations, complaint to United Nations and submissions.
They responded saying they were committed to the investigation and resolution of allegations of torture or ill treatment by the state, and that the Lake Alice settlement process is complete. But in their submission, they also said the Lake Alice claimants' allegations were factually clearly established. And we now understand that they did conduct an exhaustive research into what happened at Lake Alice. And there was advice to the Prime Minister that child torture had occurred over a number of years. So they did know about this. But they were trying to contain it, it seemed, at this point, in front of the United Nations.
Why do you think they wanted to contain it?
I think they wanted to uphold New Zealand's image as being a protector of children's rights, when in fact they were starting to look like they were taking a Stalinistic third world approach to child rights, as quoted from the report to the Prime Minister.
And can you take the Commission through CCHR response at paragraph 12 to 18 of your statement to what the government had submitted to the United Nations?
Yes, so CCHR submitted a further report in April of 2012, And in that report, it highlighted independent medical opinions by Professor Gary Walter, and you heard Victor read out a bit of that, because he was giving advice to the police. We also provided the report of Judge Galen, which the New Zealand government was now claiming had formed part of its investigation. And we were arguing that the payments to the victims of ill treatment at Lake Alice were ex gratia and not proper compensation, as they were settling an out-of-court civil action against the government. And that there was still no accountability for the perpetrators of the ill treatment and torture of the children.
How did the United Nations Committee Against Torture, UNCAT, respond to these submissions?
Yes, on May 7, 2012, the United Committee Against Torture wrote to the New Zealand government saying, "The committee is further concerned regarding allegations it has received that the state party has not conducted a prompt, impartial and effective investigation into all claims of abuse from Lake Alice, or to prosecute alleged perpetrators of the torture and ill treatment perpetrated there." Then they asked them to clarify whether they intend to do it.
What should come up on the screen now is the concluding observations from the Committee Against Torture. And that the response of UNCAT is dated 7 May 2012, page 4, paragraph 2. Can you see that there? What was it that the committee said? Can you read?
Yes, that's what just read that, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's from Phyllis Gayer, who was a rapporteur for the follow-up and concluding observations Committee Against Torture.
Tell the Commission about meeting with the UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture representatives who visited New Zealand, and that's paragraph 22 of your statement.
Yes, in May 2013, there was a United Nations Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture who oversee the Central National Preventative Mechanism. They visited New Zealand for the first time. They toured 36 places of detention. They met with civil and government organisations. And Steve Green and myself met with 3 of the members of the team from the UN. And we discussed some of their observations, especially in the mental health facilities. And they spoke of the importance of independent reports from groups such as our own, who are not connected to the official lines of politics and government, as they present an alternative viewpoint to the official one. So they welcomed our reports and the work that we do in investigating human rights abuse in the area of mental health.
Now, I'm going to take you on a bit to paragraph 33 of your statement. Please tell us about CCHR's submission to the UN in 2015.
Yes, so, now over a period of 5 years, we've been engaging with reports to the UN Committee Against Torture and presenting the Lake Alice case. And at that time, the director of CCHR, Steve Green, and Lake Alice survivor, Paul Zenfeld, travelled to Geneva to meet with the members of the Committee Against Torture and to sit in on the New Zealand 6th Periodic Review hearings. And while there, they met with 2 members of the Committee Against Torture, and Steve talked about the role of CCHR and introduced Paul as a victim of the Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital. Paul said he was there on behalf of Lake Alice survivors and told his story to the committee members. And they said that they rarely get to meet victims of torture, as they're often either dead or in regimes where they cannot easily leave. And certainly Paul was the only victim of torture from New Zealand who had appeared before the committee. So they listened to Paul's account and our own, and they greatly valued the fact that they travelled to Geneva to represent the Lake Alice case. overall the UN trip was worthwhile in terms of us bringing it sharply into focus for the committee against torture, but it still didn't make any difference to how the government was responding. We were getting support, however, from the Human Rights Commission at that time.
Can you tell us about your knowledge of how the police treated Paul Zenfeld's police complaint?
Yes, well, that was in 2015 as well, and after the UN trip. And so Paul and CCHR applied for the police record of how they regarded his complaint that he had made. And they basically found that it said they considered the treatment Paul had received could have resulted in charges being laid. So despite that finding, the police also said it was too late to prosecute and had other reasons not to prosecute. But finding that piece of information became the impetus for us to then look at how to file a formal complaint to the UN Committee Against Torture. We had tried every avenue to hold people to account over what happened at Lake Alice. It was pretty clear that the New Zealand government and the psychiatric Royal Commission, profession, did not want Dr Leeks paraded as their torturer-in-chief of children. So they weren't complying to the UN's urges to hold a public inquiry, even though they were obligated to under the Convention Against Torture. So our formal complaint, we had to provide all the necessary details, that we'd exhausted all of the remedies in this country, and it was sent to the UN in July of 2017.
How did the New Zealand government respond to this new complaint to the UN?
They didn't like it. I thought that was quite clear from their response that they did not like it. They provided a 32-page letter and 450 pages of attached evidence. And their evidence was all of the investigations that you've heard about today and previously, including the police investigation that resulted really in nothing. No one was being held to account. No one was taking any responsibility. They were individualising their investigations, so they weren't going to look at a broad number of people. So it was quite easy to show the UN that their defence was actually working against them. And the UN upheld our complaint, which they issued on the 29th of December 2019. And they rejected all of the state parties' arguments because they wanted really the complaint to be dismissed. Again, not taking responsibility for what was happening or what had happened at Lake Alice.
So I'm referring you to paragraph 46 to 48 of your statement, and this tells us what the UN Committee Against Torture's findings were, and we've got an overhead of that. And you might like to just speak to that.
So that came out on 29th of December 2019. And we found out that, you don't often win with cases at the United Nations. It's a fairly rare thing, and certainly in cases of torture and in liberal democracies such as ours. They urged the government at the end of this report to conduct a prompt, impartial and independent investigation into all allegations of torture and ill treatment made by the complainant, which was Paul, including where appropriate the filing of specific torture and ill treatment charges against the perpetrators and the application of the corresponding penalties under domestic law. B, provide the complainant with access to appropriate redress, including fair compensation and access to the truth in line with the outcome of the investigation. And lastly, to make public the present decision and disseminate its content widely with a view to preventing similar violations of the Convention in the future.
And if that overhead can be entered into the record. How did the government respond to this decision? And I refer to paragraph 49 to 54 of your statement.
The New Zealand government responded saying that there will be a new police investigation, and the already begun Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care are going to make a case study of the events at Lake Alice Children's Unit, of which we are involved in right now. And of course, this is the first public hearing of Lake Alice abuse. And in the reply, the government also said that the decision was made known with a posting on the New Zealand Police website. Not that everyone goes on the New Zealand Police website. And so when we responded, of course we were very happy that a new police investigation was now opened and that the Royal Commission will be looking into Lake Alice. We did object to just putting the decision on the New Zealand Police website. There was a very way to make it unknown. We had made some media about it, but the New Zealand government did not make this decision known. And it seemed to then again reflect that idea that on the world stage they don't want to be seen as where they have a torturer in their midst and they didn't really do anything about it. So the Human Rights Commission did put it on their website, but that was the only other agency to do so.
And by way of conclusion, there's two parts to this, and if I just refer you to paragraph 57 of your statement, and if you can just share with the Commission CCHR's recommendations for the future, and your summary on page 57, I think would be very timely.
Okay, so we've pursued the case for 45 years. We saw it as a clear-cut case of psychiatric abuse of children, taking place in a psychiatric hospital under the watch of numerous government agencies, including the Department of Health, Department of Social Welfare, and the Department of Education. And our information gathering over the 45 years showed the complaints of ill treatment, abuse and torture were covered up by officials in the agencies above, as well as the medical and nursing councils. So our recommendations, there are a few, but they basically could be summed up as saying that there has to be mechanisms so this doesn't happen again.
And these will appear on the overhead now, and that's at paragraph 78.
We also believe that the Medical Council should have investigated Dr Leeks' practice, even though he had resigned his ticket to practice here. We believe that they had the choice to do so, and they chose not to. They could have been the heroes in this story, but they weren't. They chose to hide their practitioner and give him a ticket of good practice where he could go overseas. Well, I guess that's the priesthood of psychiatry, isn't it? So I think the Medical Council, there should be something that would compel them to investigate a practitioner who practiced with their licence, with serious allegations such as we're talking about here. And also for children in care, just very quickly, that there should be a mechanism where they have a way to communicate to a safe person, such as ourselves, but it's not going to be it's not just us. I mean, we might have been ahead of our time, but to be able to communicate ill treatment that they're receiving at the hands of whoever their carer might be. And it might be a rare event, but they should have an ability to make known any kind of abuse that might occur in the future. That kind of sums it up.
Well, thank you for that, Mr Ferris, and if you can just answer any questions that
Sure.
the Commissioner has, but that concludes the statement.
Thank you, Ms Green. Do Council wish to ask any questions of these witnesses? Mr Malloy?
No, thank you, Mum. Simply acknowledge something that Mr Ferris alluded to, which is that there are not many lawyers, let alone many lay people, who have taken a matter to the United Nations, let alone succeeded there.
It's certainly a fine observation. Anybody else wish to ask any questions of these witnesses? Do you have any questions? Okay. Do you have any questions?
Yes, I do.
You do? Yes. We have a question.
Thank you, gentlemen. And first, an acknowledgement of all the years that you've been looking into this. And I think the general issues of human rights and mental health even precedes the 45 years. And partly my questions want to look at the circumstances which led to the possibility of the creation of Lake Alice and what happened there. You have talked about the potential of psychiatrists almost being above the law, abuse and mental health. But sort of expanding on those ideas of professional accountability, especially in the psychiatric profession, how that compares with the broader mental health, broader health professions and other professions, and also the environments of mental health care, mental health treatments. What is it that you see through your years as leading to the creation of the environments and the professional accountability mechanisms?
I think, well, certainly Lake Alice is an egregious example of psychiatric power gone mad. But it wasn't the only hospital where children were getting shock treatment. And essentially psychiatry's coercive power is legal through the Mental Health Act that allows them to treat a person against their will. That essentially puts them above the law when it comes to accountability of how they treat them. And proving ill intent of a psychiatrist is possibly trying to prove ill intent of a slave owner whipping his slave. They're essentially allowed to do it in that legal environment. So how do you change that? Well, make compulsory treatment illegal. Get rid of it. And we're not the ones suggesting this. It's now being suggested by the World Health Organization. It's now being suggested by the UN Committee on Disabilities. These ideas have been around for a little while. And as soon as and they're arguing that as soon as you can treat a person against their will, you're disempowering that person from getting better. You're saying you cannot decide on what's good for you. Certainly there might be cases of psychosis and periods where a person might need some intervention, but it shouldn't be for a lifetime. It shouldn't be that someone in the psychiatric agency has this ultimate control over one's future. So there is a big argument, there's a big sort of conversation around this, and our mental health inquiry started to go into this a bit. But they really need to dig in and look at what real treatment would look like without the coercion, without the compulsion, and real help in this field. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, okay. So at the moment, we haven't done all we can to prevent the kind of situations which result in violence.
Not at all. But again, when you've got children in care, there has to be accountability, but the child also has a voice, and allowing them, because one of the unique things, as we heard from Bruce and Victor, is that they visited the hospitals, the children started to tell them what was happening because they believed them. We also have heard that in other cases, the children were not believed. So and listening to this commission, we hear acknowledgements of belief of people's accounts and stories. And when it comes to putting this idea of what child torture might look like, I think we heard it yesterday with Haki, the day before, what that kind of looks like. And it is horrific. And how could you be a human being and be part of that? So, yeah.
A lot of what we've heard is from children, young people who didn't have diagnosis. There were many without and many, I think, with diagnosis who went through Lake Ellis. To what extent does that matter? Is there any justification if you do have some mental health diagnosis of compulsion of what we do to children or what has been done to children?
The idea of diagnosing behaviour is a really shady area. Some, you could say, is that they're diagnosing normal behaviour. And when it comes to children, normal behaviour can be running around and screaming and doing crazy things. And but by putting a label on behaviour, it shouldn't be a licence to treat behaviour in ways that are unwanted, even brutal. We have a big argument with labels.
Just one thing, if I could add here. The New Zealand Bill of Rights Act has got some really good aspects in that, and just one thing, that could have more clout and more respect as to uphold the Bill of Rights Act in this country.
Yep. Yes. Thank you, gentlemen. I note that there's even been calls from professionals in the last couple of weeks for a more human rights-based approach to mental health, and
Sure.
I think you were pioneers in the area. Thanks.
Thank you.
If I could just add one thing too, just the concept of originally an asylum, which is a safe place, a safe space. And sometimes the argument can be, well, the person's so erratic, possibly going to self-harm or harm others and so forth, so therefore we have to do some dramatic thing like electric shock him or so forth. So I don't subscribe to that or believe in that. I think, for example, if it absolutely comes to it, the person might need an injection to go to sleep for a little bit, but in a safe environment where the place is an asylum. It is a place where one could go where the world has become too much for the individual to be able to handle, go back to the original concept of what it was, which is a safe space. And we are not witnessing a safe space.
It remains for me to thank you three gentlemen. I don't have any questions. I think your briefs of evidence and the documentation that you provided is extraordinary and more than adequate. What I'm going to say is this, that I think it was you, Mr. Ferris, said that the medical council could have been the heroes of the story. I just want to acknowledge the heroes in this room. Mr. Zenfeld, you don't have to clap for yourself. But included, so there are many survivors who are heroes, but
Indeed.
You three gentlemen have taken up a cause for so long, 45 or more years, and I just want to honour that and to say that you are among the heroes. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Ko mutu aku mahi I tēnei wā.
Me tū mō te karakia mutuna me te waita. Please stand for the closing prayer and
Here are
song.
two more heroes coming forward.